Washington State picked up 2 huge wins without their star player. Could David Riley's club be a real challenger to Gonzaga and St. Mary's in the WCC?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Wednesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, it's WCC Wednesday. Last week on Wednesday, we talked about the new look Pac-12 and what that looks like for Gonzaga at this point. But today, we're honoring the true WCC Wednesday. We're going to take a look at what has been going on in this conference so far this season, starting with how the 2 newcomers, Oregon State and Washington State, have looked. Then we're going to talk about the stalwarts in this conference, St. Mary's, San Francisco. Santa Clara is having a bit of a down year, LMU. And then we're going to close out the show with the unfortunate, consistent bottom feeders in this league, how they've done, how they're doing, and what that means going forward for Gonzaga for the rest of the season. Starting it off with just kind of an overall look at the conference as a whole. Right now, Ken Pom has the WCC as the 7th best conference in college basketball using his rating system. The system is basically rating how a team that is expected to finish 500 in that specific conference. It basically evaluates what a 500 team in that league would look like compared to the rest of college basketball. So like for the SEC, a 500 team in the SEC is the highest rating. It's like plus 19, way above everybody else. In fact, the SEC is so far this season looking like one of the most singularly dominant college basketball conferences of all time. Kentucky certainly helped with that win over Gonzaga on Saturday. Regardless, the WCC is behind the Power 5 conferences who all have a rating of plus 10 or higher. That's, of course, the ACC, the SEC, the Big 10, the Big 12, and the Big East. The only non-power conference ahead of the WCC this season is the Mountain West, which is not far ahead. The Mountain West is plus 604. The WCC is at plus 4.8. And then the A10 is just behind the WCC at 4.51 for their ranking of an average team. I think for the A10, they have some really strong teams at the top, but they don't have anybody on the level of Gonzaga, and they have some bottom feeders at the bottom, just like the WCC. But the A10, I think, has 15 or 16 schools. The WCC not having quite as many certainly helps keep them ranked ahead of that conference for right now. Ken Pom has 5 teams in the WCC ranked inside the top 75. That's, of course, Gonzaga and St. Mary's, along with San Francisco, and then the 2 newcomers, Oregon State and Washington State, both just sneaking in to the top 75 at this point. Santa Clara is next at 88, and then there's a large gap before LMU comes in at 157, and then another very large gap with the rest of the teams in the conference all outside the top 240. That remains the issue for the WCC. They just have too many bad teams. The top 4 or 5, especially now with the temporary additions of Oregon State and Washington State, they're just so good and comparable to, not quite comparable to a lot of the power conference programs, although the top 2 in the WCC would be comparable. Top 3, arguably comparable for some of those leagues, but there's just so much drag. It's not a big league, and having 4 or 5 teams really be at the level that the teams like Portland and San Diego play at is just really, really hurting the overall kind of view of this league, the overall depth and success of this league. And it's just something that has continued to be a plague for the WCC. They're not going to kick teams out. They're attempting to add teams. Obviously, Gonzaga will be moving on, which really hurts the overall strength of this league. Seattle U comes in, and while a lot of folks want to kind of attribute Seattle U to being comparable to those bottom half teams, they're not. They're going to be much more like an LMU, maybe even Santa Clara on an off year type team. But again, additions like that don't move the needle very much as long as you still have those teams kind of bringing up the rear. Conference matchups by quad. This is what it looks like for Gonzaga right now as of December 10th through December 10th, not even through December 10th. I'm recording this before some of the games are finalized. So this will obviously change. But this kind of gives a good highlight of what the WCC does for Gonzaga from a quad perspective using the net rankings. There are 4 WCC conference matchups for Gonzaga that would fall under quad 1 as of this recording. That would be all road games against Oregon State, Washington State, St. Mary's, and San Francisco. Every one of those games would be a quad 1 game. There are also 5 quad 2 games awaiting Gonzaga. That would be Washington State, Oregon State, San Francisco, and St. Mary's. Those same 4 teams that are all quad 1 on the road, they're all going to be quad 2 games at home. And then Santa Clara on the road is also a quad 2 game. There are 2 quad 3 games. That's LMU on the road and Santa Clara at home. And then 7 quad 4 games. There's your problem. LMU is a quad 4 game, and then Portland, San Diego, Pepperdine, Pacific, all the games that Gonzaga plays against those teams, all of them qualify as quad 4 games. So that's what's really dragging down the rest of the schedule for Gonzaga. And some of this will change. Again, I think there's a real possibility that St. Mary's at home ends up being a quad 1 game for Gonzaga. Right now, it ends up looking like a quad 2 game, but that's because St. Mary's is 33rd in the net. If they end up top 30, that game becomes quad 1, and Gonzaga has 2 chances for quad 1 games against the Gales. All right, we're going to take a look at the 2 newcomers in the WCC. We'll start with Oregon State, who is the higher ranked team right now at both KenPom and the net. Although I have some, I understand how the net ranking works, but when you compare the resumes of Oregon State and Washington State right now, it's a little surprising to see the Beavers ahead of the Cougars. They're 72nd at KenPom right now. Adjusted offensive efficiency for Wayne Tinkle's team is 73rd. Defensively, they're 85th. In the net, they are 52nd. But here's the deal. Every single one of Oregon State's wins is quad 4. Every one of them. Well, 5 of their 6. Their other win is against a non-D1 opponent, so those don't factor in to the net rankings. This team is 0-2 in quad 1 games. Their loss to Oregon, which was a close game, but still a loss. They also lost to North Texas in a close game. Both those are quad 1 losses. They have not played a single quad 2 game. They have not played a single quad 3 game, and they are 5-0 in quad 4. Just not that impressive of a resume. Wayne Tinkle's club hasn't played that many teams, that many good teams yet. Their next game is against UC Irvine at home on the 14th on Saturday. That is a quad 1 opportunity for the Beavers. If they win that game, that is going to help a lot for Oregon State's resume. It's going to help for the WCC. UC Irvine's a very good team, so that's a good opportunity for this league as a whole. The Beavers are 31st in the country as a 3-point shooting team. They're just under 39% as a unit. They don't take very many of them, though. You'd like to see Coach Tinkle adjust a little bit and perhaps get some more 3-point shots up. They're averaging about 20 attempts per game, 299th in the country. So they're barely a top 300 team in terms of attempts, yet they're shooting 39%. Time to get with the times and make an adjustment there and start looking at becoming more of a volume 3-point shooting team. Mikey Rataj, the best player for the Beavers this year, a German forward. I think he's a senior, 16.5 points, 9.3 boards, 2.3 assists, 2.1 steals, 1.1 blocks per game for him. Washington State, David Riley's club, had a really nice week of action. They're 8-2 on the year, 75th at KenPom. KenPom doesn't love their offense, 118th in adjusted offensive efficiency. Does love their defense, though, 53rd in adjusted defensive efficiency. Net has them 66th again. So Oregon State 52nd at the net, Washington State 66th, yet Wazoo has 2 quad 1 wins. They have a quad 2 win. They have a quad 3 win. So 4 wins between quad 1 and quad 3 compared to 0 wins between quad 1 and quad 3 for Oregon State. And you're thinking, oh, well, it's the losses. Oregon State has 2 quad 1 losses. Wazoo has 2 quad 1 losses, but they don't have any quad 2 or quad 3 losses. Just not sure I'm getting it. Not sure I'm seeing it for Oregon State. This will obviously correct itself, assuming these 2 teams do what we expect them to do. For Wazoo, their quad 1 wins. They have a pair of them over Nevada and Boise State. Both came without Cedric Coward, which, again, the net's not going to factor that in. But the fact that Wazoo's 2 most impressive wins of the season came without their best player is certainly something to keep an eye on. Their 2 quad 1 losses are to Iowa and SMU. They have a win over Bradley in quad 2, a win over Northern Colorado in quad 3, and then 4 quad 4 victories. Their next game is against Missouri State on Saturday. That's a quad 4 game for them as a home game. Cedric Coward through 6 games this year, 17 points, 7 points, 7 boards, 3.7 assists, and 1.7 blocks. He has been phenomenal. And like I said, Wazoo picked up those pair of victories without him on the floor. Part of that has been the addition of UW transfer guard Nate Calmise, who is averaging about 16 points and 4.5 assists per game. But this has been a balanced effort from David Riley's club. Outside of Calmise and Cedric Coward, there's 4 other players for the Cougars averaging between 10.4 and 12.6 points per game. Dane Erickstrup, Lawan Watts, Isaiah Watts. This team has looked very good this season, and I think they're going to be a real challenger for both. I don't think they're going to be ahead of Gonzaga or St. Mary's. I think ultimately that's still your top 2 teams in the WCC, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if Wazoo finishes 3rd. I think it's very possible that Wazoo ultimately ends up earning an at-large bid. They got to go pretty close to perfect from here on out, at least perfect in the sense of they can lose to Gonzaga, they can maybe lose to St. Mary's, but I don't think they can go 0-4 in those 4 games. I think they probably got to go 2-2. If you go 1-3 and you win every single other game you play this year, 5-loss team, then yeah, you're probably in. But that's the margin. It's razor thin for Wazoo. But David Riley's club has looked very good in the early going, so that may continue to be a promising sign for the WCC, at least for this year. Obviously, it's a short-term thing with Wazoo and Oregon State. We're going to move on. Santa Clara has not looked like themselves this year. We're going to talk about them, plus what we've seen from St. Mary's and San Francisco. All that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and you will get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And the Zags odds to take home a national title remain at plus 1,200 at FanDuel. That's behind Auburn at plus 750, behind Duke at plus 900, and tied with Houston at plus 1,200. If you like those odds, if you like any of the upcoming game odds over on FanDuel, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and it's still WCC Wednesday here on Locked On Zags. So today, in the second segment, we're going to talk about the 4 primary competitors against Gonzaga over the last few years in the WCC. We already talked about Oregon State and Washington State as the 2 newcomers. So now we're going to talk St. Mary's, San Francisco, Santa Clara, and LMU, how they've looked so far this season. And then we'll close out the show talking about the rest of the WCC and what that has looked like for them. Start with Randy Bennett's Gales, 9-1 on the year, 34th at KenPom, 33rd at the net. Still struggling to see why this team is not picking up as many votes as they have in the AP poll. They're getting votes. I think they were 40th, 44th, somewhere in there in the most recent AP voting, but it just feels like a team that should be in that top 25 conversation. Randy Bennett's club, 42nd in adjusted offensive efficiency and 28th in adjusted defensive efficiency. A little lower than we're used to seeing for Bennett and the Gales, but they'll probably continue to move up as the season goes on. Like we said, 33rd in the net, so just outside the top 30, which is what would lead to that home game against St. Mary's being a quad 1 game for the Zags. The Gales are 1-1 in quad 1 games so far this year. They beat Utah most recently. They lost to Arizona State. That's their only loss on the season. Certainly not a bad loss with how we've seen Bobby Hurley's Sun Devils play this year. The Gales are 1-0 in quad 2 games with a nice win over Nebraska on a neutral site. And then they're 3-0 in both quad 3 and quad 4. The next game for the Gales is a big one. They're taking on Boise State in Idaho Falls, a neutral site game, a semi-neutral site game. It's obviously a lot closer to the Broncos than it is for the Gales, but this will be a quad 1 opportunity for Randy Bennett's team. So a good opportunity to move that record to 2-1 in those quad 1 games, go 10-1 on the year. And by that point, hopefully start to really move the needle in terms of being a top 25 club, hopefully for the WCC. I know that there's a lot of Gonzaga fans who don't particularly care one way or the other if St. Mary's is ranked, but it is good for the league and it is good for the Zags if that happens. A lot of the conversation around St. Mary's has been the loss of Aiden Mahaney and Joshua Jefferson from last year's club, but they went out and got Paulus Morauskas, a transfer from Arizona, and Mikey Lewis, an incoming freshman. Frankly, they're replacing those two guys incredibly adequately so far this year. Morauskas is averaging 15 points, 9.5 boards, 1.3 assists so far this season. He has been a double-double machine, replacing Jefferson at the power forward spot for the Gales. And then Mikey Lewis, true freshman, only playing 17 minutes a game, but he's averaging 10 points, 2.5 boards, shooting a whopping 39% from three. Lewis is not quite as productive as Mahaney was as a freshman, but considering he's doing it in a much smaller role, if you're a Gales fan, you probably feel pretty good about what you have in Mikey and Morauskas, especially after the consternation for this team after losing both Jefferson and Mahaney to the portal. Next up, we got the Dons of San Francisco. Chris Gerlofson's club, 7-2 on the year, 58th at KenPom, 63rd offensively, 46th defensively. They are 50th in the net, so kind of hanging right into that quad 1, quad 2 status for neutral site games, I guess, which doesn't really apply for the Zags. In this case, San Francisco is 0-2 in their 2 quad 1 opportunities. Memphis, a very close game throughout. They could have won. Clemson, a team they were beating at halftime, but got rocked in the second half by a Tigers team that has looked very, very good throughout the season. However, 2 losses in quad 1, but they have 7 other wins. 5 of them are quad 4, but they do have a quad 2 win over Boise State, and they have a quad 3 win as well. The next game for this team is tonight against Stanislaus State, a non-D1 opponent. So it won't really count for their net rankings, but should be a nice tune-up for the Dons going forward. Malik Thomas has been the star player for San Francisco, just under 18 points per game. But freshman Tyrone Riley is certainly a name to keep an eye on. 12 points, 5 boards, shooting about 42% from 3, long, rangy, stretch 4 type player. Really nice addition for Coach G and the Dons. Santa Clara has been a bit of a disappointment so far this season, although they seem to be kind of righting the ship as of late. 5-5 on the year, 88th at KenPom, 91st offensively, 99th defensively, and they're 89th in the net. So really right around that late 80s, early 90s for their kind of rankings all across the board. They are 0-2 in quad 1 games with losses to Arizona State and Nevada. They do have 2 quad 2 wins, which were over McNeese early, in fact, on the first day of the season, and then a win over TCU much more recently. They also have a quad 2 loss to Stanford. The big issue for Santa Clara is losing games they should not be losing. They have 2 quad 3 losses, which is really holding down the resume. They did beat St. Louis. That's a quad 3 win, but they lost to North Dakota State and UW, which are both quad 3 losses for them right now. And then they got 2 quad 4 wins. Their next game is a quad 2 opportunity against Bradley in Las Vegas on Saturday. So we'll see if they can pick that one up and help boost the resume even more. Adama Ball has not looked like himself this year. It's starting to be a question of whether he should have returned to school last year or stayed in the NBA draft process. He's averaging 12 points, 2.8 boards, 2 assists. He's shooting under 48% on 2-pointers and under or about 32% from 3. Very few additions for Santa Clara this year, but one of them was Elijah Mahi, and he's been great. 12.2 points, 4.5 boards, about 2 assists, and he's shooting a whopping 48% from beyond the arc. Last but not least here, before we get into some of the not so good teams in the WCC, we got LMU, the Lions, Stan Johnson's club, not looking great. In fact, with how strong of an offseason it was in terms of kind of perceived value that they added in the portal, you start to wonder if this team doesn't deliver this year, how much longer Stan Johnson's going to keep his job coaching at LMU. They're 157th at KenPom, 189th offensively, 144th defensively. The net doesn't like them either, 194th at the net, and that's because they have 2 quad 3 losses and a quad 4 loss. That is brutal for the Lions. They are 0-1 in quad 1 with the loss being to Irvine. They are 1-0 in quad 2 games, having defeated Nevada. Quad 3, they're 2-2 with wins over Belmont and Wyoming and losses to St. Louis and Colorado State. They got to hope that Colorado State loss ends up moving up to the quad 2 range. And then 0-1 in quad 4 because they lost to North Dakota at home, a brutal loss for this team. Their next game is a quad 4 opportunity at home against Prairie View on the 14th of December. A couple players to note: Javon Porter, the transfer from Pepperdine. He's averaging 14.5 points, 8 boards, and 2 blocks. Not shooting it all that well from beyond the arc yet, 32.5%. Jan Vide was their other kind of big-time transfer portal addition from UCLA. A lot of folks kind of likened him to, hey, maybe he's a Brandon Pajemski type, like a breakout candidate after not playing much for UCLA. I said a lot of folks. I will also happily include myself in that conversation, really pushing the narrative that Vide was going to be a breakout star. Hasn't happened. 6.5 points per game coming off the bench, 2.6 assists, only shooting 33% on a very low volume from 3. Thought that we'd see a big growth from him, and just hasn't happened. Maybe it will in the second half of the year, but so far not looking great for him or the Lions in general in the WCC. Well, it's no secret, and we've been talking about it all show. The bottom half of the WCC has really dragged this conference down for many years, decades, in fact. And that's just not about to change. We're going to talk more about that coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, closing out WCC Wednesday here with a look at the bottom half, the bottom 4 clubs, I should say, in the WCC, how they've looked so far this year. I'll tell you right now, I'm recording this prior to the 2 WCC games on Tuesday evening. That is Portland hosting New Orleans and San Diego hosting Long Beach State. I believe hosting Long Beach State. Yes, they're hosting them. So the data for those 2 teams is going to be a little bit off. But we're going to start with Pepperdine. The Waves 4-6, new coach Ed Schilling, who was an assistant at Grand Canyon. 4-6 on the year, like we said, 243rd at Ken Pom, 246th in the net. They're 258th in adjusted offensive efficiency, 206th in adjusted defensive efficiency, and they don't have a single win outside of Quad 4. They're 0-3 in Quad 1 games with losses to Irvine, UC San Diego, and Northwestern out of the Big Ten. They have not played a Quad 2 game. They're 0-1 in those Quad 3 games with a loss to UNLV, and then just 3-2 in Quad 4. They beat Western Illinois, they beat New Mexico State, they beat Grambling, but they lost to Cal State Fullerton in the Big West, and they lost to Big Sky opponent Weber State. Their next game is against Northern Arizona, the Fighting Gary Bells on Saturday at home. That's a Quad 4 game for them. But this Pepperdine team has not looked impressive under new coach Schilling. We'll see if he gets longer than just, 10 games to prove himself, obviously, but it hasn't really been much of a difference. They did add a player, Stefan Todorovic, as a transfer portal from San Francisco, and he's been one of the highest. I believe he is currently the leading scorer in the WCC. He's averaging a hair under 19 points per game, along with 5.5 boards, 2 assists, shooting 38% from beyond the arc. They also added Mo Odom, another WCC transfer from Pacific. Odom's averaging 11 points, 7.2 assists, and himself shooting 38.5% from 3. This Pepperdine team has some 3-point shooters, has some scoring, but doesn't have a lot of depth. Hasn't looked particularly good on either end of the floor yet this year. Speaking of new coaches in the conference, Dave Smart and the Pacific Tigers have yet to really showcase that exciting offense from the Canadian coach who was incredibly successful in his home country. Pacific's 5-6 on the year. Ken Pom has them 266th. The net has them 270th. Similarly to Pepperdine, all of their wins are Quad 4 or against non-D1 opponents. They are 0-2 in Quad 1 games, having played 2 SEC teams in Arkansas and Missouri. They're 0-1 in Quad 2 games, having played Colorado. They're 0-2 in Quad 3 games, having lost to both Hawaii and Illinois State. And then 3-1 in those Quad 4 games. They're lost to that same NAU team, the Gary Bell. Gary Bell is an assistant coach. For the Lumberjacks, they're 3 Quad 4 wins: San Jose State, Arkansas Pine Bluff, and Cal State Fullerton. Next game for Pacific's a Quad 3 opportunity on the road against UNLV. Elias Ralph has been the big-time addition for this team. He kind of followed Coach Smart from Canada, where he was playing at a university up there. Really, really good addition for this team. 17 points, 8 boards, 2.3 assists, 1.3 blocks, shooting 62% on 2-pointers. And then Elijah Fisher, another big-time transfer portal addition for this club. 16.8 points, 5 boards, 1.7 assists, shooting about 35% from 3. 2 more teams to get to, like I said. Recording this before Portland hosts New Orleans on Tuesday evening, but as of this recording, they are 3-6. Hope they beat This Kansas City team, by the time you're listening to this, and they are 4-6 because they are expected to win that one. KenPom has them currently 304th. Net has them 312th. Like the rest of the teams we've talked about, no wins outside of quad 4. They're 0-1 in quad 1 with that devastating overtime loss to Oregon. They should have won that one. It was so tough to watch them squander that one. They're 0-1 in quad 2 with a blowout loss to Kent State. They're 0-4 in quad 3 with losses to Santa Barbara, to South Florida, to Ohio, and to Princeton. And then their 2 wins both come quad 4, Long Beach State and Denver. Again, potentially a 3rd win there for New Orleans. If it's a loss, woof. They're continuing to move down the KenPom and Net rankings. Their next game is going to be on Wednesday, December 18th, when they host Cal State Bakersfield. That's a quad 4 game for them. Vukasin Masic has been their best player, 14.5 points, 4.5 boards, 4 assists, shooting 62.5% on 2-pointers. And just like last year when they added a star freshman in Tyler Harris, they have another star freshman, Shante Leggins. For all the struggles he's had defensively in particular, and really just being able to land talent, he has found good freshmen routinely in his time at Oregon. Their latest success story, Austin Rapp from Australia, averaging 12.6 boards, 2.5 assists, shooting 41.1% from 3. He's been a very fun addition for the Pilots and Coach Leggins. Last and least, Steve Lavin and the San Diego Toreros, 291st at KenPom. Adjusted offensive efficiency is 357th. They are literally one of the 10 worst offensive teams in the entire country. Again, recording this before their game against Long Beach State, so perhaps they have climbed up a little bit in those adjusted offensive rankings, although I doubt very much. 315th at the net. Again, like everybody else in this bottom half of the conference, they have not won a game outside of quad 4. Their 2 wins in that area are Boston University and Idaho. They're 0-2 in quad 1 games with losses to Arizona State and San Diego State. No shame in either of those losses, but they haven't played a quad 2 game. They have a quad 3 loss to Idaho State, and then they have quad 4 losses to Southern Utah, Portland State, and Rider. Can't have 3 quad 4 losses and 0 wins quad 1, 2, or 3 and expect to be anywhere else but around 300th at KenPom. This is legitimately the worst 3-point shooting team in the country. Again, recording before the Long Beach State game, but coming into that game, they're shooting 23.3% as a team from 3. This was one of the big knocks on Steve Lavin when he took this job. He hadn't been in college basketball as a coach for about 7 years. Prior to that, he'd been at St. John's. Prior to that, he'd been at UCLA, but he'd been broadcasting. He comes in to coach at San Diego in a new era with the 3-point shooting revolution, just from an on-floor perspective. His ability to get his team to shoot a high volume of threes and shoot successfully has not been there. His ability to defend the 3-point line has not been there. He's also trying to navigate the newness of the transfer portal and NIL and things of that nature. We've seen San Diego be very inactive in the transfer portal, continue to recruit freshmen who then leave after a year. It just feels like Lavin is not adjusted to the modern era of college basketball. I am very curious how much longer San Diego is going to put up with this. Lavin's a big name, and you'd think that that would help this program, but they have not only not improved since Steve Lavin took over, they have gotten worse, and it's just hard to imagine the program will continue to put up with this, what has been a really, really tumultuous, challenging season and tenure for the Toreros. Junior college transfer KJ Bradley's been their best player, 15.7 points, 3.4 boards, 3.4 assists, and 2.2 steals. Want to give a shout out as well to former Zag walk-on Colby Brooks, who didn't play in the first few games for San Diego. We weren't sure if he was injured or redshirting or what the deal was there. He has now played in 4 games for San Diego, averaging 7.3 minutes, 3.3 points, 1.8 rebounds, shooting a very productive 62.5% on 2-pointers, has not taken any threes yet this year. Not going to pretend I'm super interested in watching a lot more San Diego basketball, but I will say I want to see how Colby Brooks does. It's always been something I've enjoyed and wanted to see how a player who walked on at Gonzaga would do getting an opportunity to play at another Division I school. We've seen like Matthew Lang transfer to Arizona, but he walked on over there. We saw Will Graves transfer to a Division III school, but we haven't really seen an opportunity for a full-on walk-on to play D1 ball somewhere else. Colby Brooks is kind of our fun opportunity to see that, so I will be continuing to update how he is doing for the Toreros this year. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast, folks. Thank you so much to those of you who have made the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We're going to have more WCC coverage as we get into conference play. We're going to have more about how the net rankings are shaking out, what it means for Gonzaga for their resume going forward this season. Of course, for the rest of the week, we're going to get you ready for that exciting game on Saturday, 5 p.m. Pacific time at the Madison Square Garden. Gonzaga taking on the UConn Huskies. That's going to be a blast of a game. We'll get you ready for that one coming up later this week. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.